At a small-town auction, amidst the noise, the hustle and bustle, the money, and the bargain-hunting crowd, a hungry German shepherd sat silently. No one bid, no one raised their hand, no one wanted to take it home. Until a former K9 seal stood up, and what happened next astonished the entire town. It wasn't just about saving a dog's life. It changed the dog's life in ways no one could have predicted. Sometimes silence is more valuable than unnecessary noise. If this story resonates with you, please leave a comment. The wind came first, sharp and dry, dragging winter down from the mountains and pressing it flat against the town like a warning that warmth was no longer welcome. The auction yard sat on the edge of town where the road turned to gravel and the buildings stopped pretending they were permanent. Weathered boards leaned against one another out of habit more than strength, and the barn roof groaned softly as gusts rolled across it. Jack Miller stepped out of his truck and paused, his breath fogging the air. He stood tall without meaning to, broad shoulders squared by years of muscle memory, even though no one here expected anything from him. His dark beard was trimmed short, more from discipline than vanity, and gray had begun threading through it in a way that made him look older than his 42 years. The green seal jacket he wore had faded at the elbows, the fabric softened by time and weather, but he hadn't replaced it. Some things didn't get replaced. They just stayed. Jack hadn't come for the auction. Not really. He was here to meet a clerk about paperwork tied to a narrow strip of land outside town, 40 acres of scrub and trees that had belonged to a teammate who never came home. Selling it felt like closing a door he hadn't yet learned how to stand in front of. But money had become a language life forced him to speak again. After the Navy, after the K9 unit, after the silence that followed both, practical needs had replaced purpose with an efficiency that felt almost cruel. He told himself this was just business, a transaction, nothing more. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the mixed smells of hay, old coffee, diesel, and wet wool. People clustered along the wooden rails, boots scuffing, hands tucked into coat pockets, faces drawn tight against the cold. The auctioneer's voice bounced off the walls with practiced confidence, selling farm tools and aging livestock to a crowd that knew the rhythm well enough not to look surprised by anything anymore. Jack stayed near the back, his posture relaxed but alert, eyes scanning without conscious effort. He had learned long ago that danger rarely announced itself loudly. The handlers brought the cage out after a pause that lasted half a breath too long. It was metal, rusted at the joints, the kind of crate meant to be moved, not lived in. The wheels squealed as it crossed the floor, and conversation thinned into a hush that felt less like respect and more like avoidance. Inside the cage was a German shepherd, young but barely, its frame too narrow, ribs faintly visible beneath patchy fur. He was maybe a year old, 12 or 14 months at most, though starvation had carved him down into something smaller, something unfinished. His coat, once black and tan, had dulled into muted browns, and his ears, though upright, angled slightly back as if listening for something no one else could hear. The dog didn't bark. He didn't press against the bars or whine the way frightened animals often did. He simply sat, body coiled inward, tail wrapped tight along his legs. His eyes were dark and steady, not pleading, not wild, just tired. There was calculation in them, a quiet assessment that unsettled people more than noise ever could. Jack felt it land in his chest like a familiar weight. He had seen that look before, not in dogs at first, but in men who had learned that reacting too fast could cost everything. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man with thinning hair and a voice roughened by years of shouting over crowds, cleared his throat and tried to sound upbeat. He offered a short description, guessed at the dog's age, mentioned the breed like it was a selling point that should explain the rest. He started the bid higher than anyone expected, then dropped it quickly when no hands rose. 50, 40, 25. Each number echoed off the walls and came back empty. People shifted their weight. A woman near the front, a middle-aged rancher with wind-burned cheeks and pale hair, pulled tight at the nape of her neck, murmured something under her breath, and looked away. No one met the dog's eyes for long. Jack told himself to leave. This wasn't why he was here. He had already lost one partner. He had already buried enough loyalty to last a lifetime. The last K9 he'd worked with, an older shepherd named Ranger, had died overseas, and the silence that followed had been louder than gunfire. Since then, Jack had learned to move through the world without attachments that breathed. It was easier that way, cleaner, safer. He clenched his jaw and shifted his stance, ready to turn back toward the door. Then the dog moved. Not much, just a slight lift of the head, a subtle straightening of the spine, as if he had sensed something change in the room. His gaze slid past the handlers, past the auctioneer, and found Jack. There was no recognition there, no magic, no sudden spark, just awareness. As if the dog had clocked him the way trained animals did, by posture, by stillness, by the way some people took up space without needing to announce themselves. Jack felt his breath stall. That look wasn't fear, it wasn't hope either. It was expectation that had learned not to expect anything good. Something tightened behind Jack's ribs, sharp and unwelcome. He remembered a briefing room years ago, the low hum of generators outside the wire, Ranger pressed against his knee, steady as a promise. Trust wasn't a feeling. It was a decision, repeated every day until it became instinct. The dog in the cage had known that once. Jack could see it in the way he held himself, even now. The auctioneer's gavel hovered. "Last call," the man said, voice faltering just enough to betray his relief that this uncomfortable moment might end. Jack reached into his jacket pocket without thinking. His fingers brushed folded bills, worn soft from being counted too many times. He knew exactly how much was there. He had counted it that morning, twice, the way people did when the margin for error disappeared. It was supposed to last him the week. Jack raised his hand. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't stand tall or speak loudly. He simply lifted his fingers shoulder high and said, "I'll take him." His voice was calm, low, carrying easily across the barn. Heads turned. The auctioneer blinked, then nodded, as if grateful for permission to move on. The price dropped to match what Jack had, and the gavel came down with a crack that sounded final in more ways than one. The paperwork was brief. A young clerk slid a clipboard across a scarred wooden desk near the wall. She was in her late 20s, slender, with auburn hair tucked beneath a knit cap, freckles standing out against pale winter skin. Her name tag read Sarah. She glanced from the form to Jack's face, her eyes soft with concern rather than curiosity. "You sure?" she asked quietly. Her voice carried the fatigue of someone who had learned that asking questions didn't always change outcomes. Jack nodded once. He didn't trust himself to explain. Outside, the wind cut harder. The handlers wheeled the cage into the open, their movements cautious but professional. Jack crouched in front of it, joints protesting softly as he lowered himself to the dog's level. He took off one glove, revealing a hand scarred across the knuckles, the skin thickened by years of work and impact. He didn't reach in. He didn't rush. He simply rested his hand against the cold metal and waited. The dog watched him closely. His nostrils flared once, twice, tasting the air. Slowly, he leaned forward until his nose hovered inches from Jack's fingers. The contact was brief, a whisper of warmth against skin, but it was enough. Jack felt it like a current, not connection, not yet, but permission. "All right," Jack murmured, more to himself than the dog. "That's enough for today." He stood, signed the last line, and guided the cage toward his truck. As he secured it in the bed with an old strap, he was aware of eyes on his back, of the quiet ripple that followed him out of the auction yard. He didn't turn around. He had learned that some choices didn't need witnesses. The engine started with a familiar growl. Jack climbed into the cab, hands steady on the wheel. In the rearview mirror, the dog sat facing forward, braced against the cold, ears angled toward the road ahead. He didn't cry. He didn't thrash. He simply rode. Jack exhaled slowly, something heavy loosening in his chest without fully leaving. He hadn't come here looking for redemption. He hadn't come looking for hope. But as the truck rolled onto the empty road and the barn shrank behind him, Jack knew one thing with absolute clarity. He hadn't walked away. Not this time. Snow settled into the forest with the patience of something that intended to stay, softening edges, muting sound, and turning distance into a white, unknowable thing. The cabin sat several miles beyond the last plowed road, a low, square structure of dark timber crouched among fir trees that bent but did not break under winter's weight. Jack Miller carried the cage inside without ceremony, setting it near the wall closest to the door, where cold air slipped in through imperfect seams. The place smelled of pine resin, old smoke, and long solitude. One main room, a narrow kitchen corner, a wood stove blackened by years of steady use. Nothing decorative, nothing unnecessary. It was the kind of shelter built by someone who trusted function more than comfort, and Jack had learned to live that way long before the Navy taught him how. He left the cage door closed. That choice was deliberate. Freedom offered too soon could feel like a threat, and Jack knew better than most how panic followed sudden permission. He filled a metal bowl with water, another with dry kibble that had sat untouched in a cupboard for years, then slid both across the floor until they rested just inside the bars. He backed away without looking directly at the dog, lowering himself into a chair near the stove, boots planted wide, posture loose but ready. The silence pressed in, thick and honest. Max did not move. The young German shepherd remained coiled in the far corner of the cage, body angled toward the door, eyes tracking every shift of Jack's weight. Up close, the damage was clearer. His coat was uneven, fur thinned along the flanks. His hips jutted too sharply for an animal his age. But there was structure beneath the damage, muscle memory held in the way he balanced his weight, in the disciplined stillness of his breathing. He was not feral. He was careful. There was a difference, and Jack felt it settle somewhere deep, unwelcome, and familiar. Night came early. The stove ticked as heat spread slowly through the room. Wind moved through the trees outside, a low, constant whisper that never quite resolved into sound. Jack sat until his coffee went cold, staring into the dark surface as if it might offer instructions. Sleep, when it came, was thin and fractured. He woke to the same dream he always did. Dust, shouting, ranger's weight pulling hard at the leash, then nothing at all. When he opened his eyes, the room was dim and gray. Max had not touched the food. The water level was unchanged. Days fell into a rhythm shaped more by weather than intention. Jack split wood, checked the generator, walked the short fence line that marked the edge of what he still called his land. He spoke little, even to himself. When he did, his voice was low, practical, the way men talked when words were tools instead of bridges. Max watched everything. He learned the cabin's sounds quickly, the creak of the floor near the stove, the scrape of the chair legs, the pause. In Jack's breathing, that meant he was listening rather than resting. He never ate while Jack was standing. When Jack slept, Max slept lightly, ears twitching at every shift of air. On the third morning, Jack noticed the water bowl was lower. He did not react. He refilled it without comment, sliding it back into place and returning to his chair. Hope, he had learned, could spook fragile things faster than fear. That afternoon, snow fell harder, thick flakes swirling sideways as the wind rose. Jack turned on the small radio he kept near the sink, the one piece of connection he allowed himself when storms threatened to cut him off completely. Static crackled, then resolved into the voice of a local announcer, calm but tight around the edges. Another person overdue. A ranch hand who hadn't come home before dark. Search planned once conditions allowed. Jack turned the volume down. Max's head lifted at the sound, ears angling forward, body tightening. He stood, paced once along the length of the cage, then settled again near the door, nose pointed toward the seam where cold air crept in. Jack watched him from the corner of his eye. It meant nothing, he told himself. Dogs reacted to tone, to tension. Still, something about the timing lodged uncomfortably in his chest. The following day, Jack drove into town for supplies. He hadn't planned to stop at the auction office, but old habits pulled him there anyway. Sarah was behind the counter, the same auburn hair tucked into a wool cap, the same faint lines of tired kindness around her eyes. In daylight, she looked more worn than she had in the barn, slender shoulders slightly hunched, fingers ink-stained from paperwork. She greeted Jack with a cautious smile that didn't ask questions he might not answer. "How's the dog?" she asked, voice neutral, as if asking about weather. "Still there," Jack said. It was the closest he came to optimism. She nodded, understanding more than the words offered. "Storms got folks nervous," she added. "Two now, one found, one not yet." Her mouth tightened briefly, a sign of someone who had learned to file worry away where it wouldn't interfere with work. Jack thanked her and left, the conversation lingering longer than it should have. Back at the cabin, Max drank while Jack unpacked supplies with his back turned. The sound was faint but unmistakable. Jack paused, hands resting on the counter, and waited until it stopped before moving again. That night, Max ate a handful of kibble, lifting each piece carefully, carrying it back to the corner like something too valuable to consume all at once. Jack watched without comment, the firelight catching on the dog's eyes, revealing something like calculation rather than hunger. Sleep came easier that night, not deep, but present. On the fifth day, a neighbor stopped by unannounced. Tom Weaver, late 50s, broad through the chest, but softening at the edges, beard thick and graying, eyes sharp with a suspicion shaped by hard winters and harder losses. He stood on the porch rather than stepping inside, boots planted wide, hands visible. Max rose silently, positioning himself between Jack and the door, body angled, ears forward, tail low but steady. There was no growl, no bark, just intent. Tom noticed immediately, his posture shifting from casual to respectful without conscious thought. "That yours?" he asked, nodding toward Max. "Working on it," Jack replied. Tom didn't push. Men who survived places like this learned when curiosity was dangerous. He handed Jack a small stack of mail that had landed in the wrong box and left without stepping closer. Only when his truck disappeared down the road did Max relax, returning to his place near the door as if nothing had happened. That night, wind rattled the cabin harder than before. A branch scraped the roof, sending a sharp sound through the dark. Max was on his feet instantly, body rigid, eyes fixed on the ceiling. He waited a full minute after the noise stopped before settling again. Jack lay awake long after, staring into the dark, the shape of understanding beginning to take form without fully revealing itself. By the end of the week, Max lay outside the cage during the day, never far from it, always positioned so he could see both Jack and the door. He followed Jack at a distance when chores took them outside, stopping when Jack stopped, watching when he worked. He did not play. He did not wander. Everything he did had purpose, even if neither of them could name it yet. Jack noticed the way Max reacted to changes in the air, to distant sounds that reached him seconds before Jack heard them. He noticed how the dog angled himself uphill when they walked the property, never placing himself below Jack. None of it felt accidental. None of it felt safe to acknowledge too soon. Two survivors learning the shape of each other's silence. The sky lowered itself over the valley as if listening, clouds thickening into a dull metallic ceiling that pressed sound back into the trees and made distance feel closer than it was. By late morning, the wind had changed its voice, no longer wandering, but moving with intent, sliding through the firs in steady bands that carried scent and cold together. Jack Miller felt it before he named it, the old pressure behind the eyes that came when weather stopped being background and became a decision-maker. Max felt it sooner. The young German shepherd rose from his place by the door without prompting and stood squarely in front of it, body angled, ears forward, eyes narrowed, as if the air itself had begun to speak in a language he understood. He did not bark. He did not pace. He waited, reading. Jack watched him from the kitchen counter, hands resting on the wood, heart tightening in a way he didn't welcome. He reached for the radio out of habit, then stopped, listening instead. The stove ticked. Outside, a gust lifted snow from the ground and laid it back down somewhere else. Max shifted once, nose lifting, nostrils flaring, and then glanced back at Jack, not for reassurance, but for permission to acknowledge what he already knew. Jack didn't give it. Not yet. The radio crackled to life an hour later, static, heavy at first, then resolving into the clipped calm of the county dispatcher. A teenager was overdue. 17. Dirt bike found tipped near the edge of public land, helmet still strapped, conditions worsening, volunteers asked to stand by. Jack turned the volume down, jaw set. Max's ears flicked at the cadence of the voice, at the word overdue, at the way urgency hid behind practiced control. The dog moved to the window, peered out into the whitening world, then returned to the door, planting himself there like a statement. Jack paced once, then stopped. Max was still underweight. His coat hadn't fully recovered. His muscles, though waking, were not yet reliable. And Jack knew better than to confuse instinct with readiness. He remembered Ranger's early days, the long months of structured work before trust was allowed to translate into action. He remembered what happened when men rushed dogs into situations their bodies hadn't yet agreed to survive. He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of responsibility settle heavy and familiar. "Not today," he said quietly, more to himself than the dog. They went anyway. Jack justified it with careful language that sounded like restraint. They would only check the perimeter. They would not commit. They would turn back at the first sign of trouble. Max leaned into the harness when Jack clipped it on, posture eager but contained, tail low, breathing steady. Outside, the world had begun to erase itself. Snow moved sideways, fine and sharp, reducing the landscape to shapes and guesses. Jack kept the leash short, his own movements measured, eyes scanning for landmarks he'd walked 100 times in better light. At first, Max worked like a student reciting lessons, nose low, steps deliberate, stopping often to reassess. He found disturbed snow where a bike had skidded, the faint chemical tang of fuel, the warmer trace of human scent, layered thin beneath cold. Jack let him work, hands light on the line, heart steadying as familiar patterns emerged. Then the wind shifted again, sudden and loud, a gust that tore across the open cut and scattered scent like broken glass. Max faltered, his head snapped up, ears flattening. He turned in a tight circle, confused, the line tugging sharp between them. Jack felt the change instantly, the way a handler did when confidence slipped its moorings. "Easy," he said, voice calm, low, the tone he used when fear tried to borrow urgency. Max took 2 steps forward, then froze. Another gust hit, harder this time, carrying sound from nowhere and everywhere at once. The dog bolted. It wasn't panic the way people imagined it. There was no wild thrashing, no noise. Max simply pulled hard, then slipped the line with a twist of practiced urgency and ran, back the way they had come, back toward the known. Jack cursed once and followed, boots sinking, breath burning as he fought the wind and the sting of old fear. He found Max at the tree line, crouched low, eyes wide, chest heaving, shame written in the set of his shoulders like a language Jack recognized too well. They went home without speaking. Back in the cabin, Jack sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor as if it might offer absolution. He told himself he had expected this, that the mistake was his, not the dog's, that he should have known better than to ask so much so soon. Max lay near the door, not touching the cage, not touching Jack, breathing slowing as the storm howled outside. He did not look up. Jack didn't force him to. Night fell fast, the storm committing fully now, snow piling against a cabin in quiet insistence. Jack fed the stove, checked the generator, went through motions that felt older than memory. He did not reach for Max. He did not apologize. Some failures needed space to cool before they could be handled without breaking something else. It was Max who closed the distance. Sometime past midnight, Jack felt movement and opened his eyes to the dim glow of embers. Max stood a few feet away, posture changed, ears forward again, tail still. He did not approach. He waited. The storm outside shifted tone, wind rising and falling like breath. Max took a step closer, then stopped, gaze fixed on Jack's face, as if asking a question only Jack could answer. Jack sat up slowly, heart thudding, and met that gaze without flinching. "All right," Jack said softly. The word held more than permission. It held surrender. "Show me." They moved again into the storm, this time without urgency and without plan. Jack let the leash go slack, following rather, then directing, trusting Max to decide when to stop and when to move. The dog worked differently now, less eager, more deliberate. He circled wider, tested angles, waited through gusts rather than fighting them. When scent broke apart, he didn't chase it. He paused, repositioned, tried again. Jack mirrored him, adjusting pace, breathing with the dog instead of ahead of him. They found the ravine by accident or by something that felt like it. Max stopped at the lip, body tense, then angled down, testing footing before committing. He dug once, twice, snow spraying back, then barked, a single sharp sound that cut clean through the wind. Jack slid down beside him, heart hammering, and saw the shape below. A boy curled on his side, jacket iced stiff, breath shallow but present, alive. Barely. Jack moved fast then, training snapping into place, hands working through layers and checks, while Max stood over the boy, body angled to block the worst of the wind. Jack keyed the radio, voice steady despite the burn in his lungs, relaying coordinates he half guessed and half trusted. He didn't let go of Max's harness until headlights cut through the white, and voices rose from the dark. They rode back in silence, the storm easing as if its work was done. In the cab, Max curled tight against the heater vent, eyes open, alert even in exhaustion. Jack drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting lightly against the dog's shoulder, grounding himself in the reality of warmth and breath. He did not praise. He did not celebrate. Some victories needed quiet to survive the telling. By morning, the storm had moved on, leaving the land bruised but intact. Jack sat at the table with cold coffee and the weight of understanding settling into place. Max lay at his feet, closer than before, posture calm and resolved. Jack realized then what had changed. Not the dog, but the way he listened. Instinct hadn't vanished. It had waited, patient as weather, for someone willing to follow instead of command. The storm returned before dawn, not as a surprise, but as a consequence. The kind of weather that did not rage so much as decide, sealing roads, flattening sound, and turning the world into a narrow corridor of choices. Jack Miller woke to the radio already murmuring, the dispatcher's voice stripped of ceremony and patience. Visibility near zero. Search teams stalled. One location confirmed, the ravine west of the service road. The boy was alive. Barely, and en route to the clinic, but the message carried a second weight. Others were still unaccounted for, and the storm was not finished asking questions. Jack sat up slowly, joints stiff, breath measured. At his feet, Max was awake, posture aligned with the door, ears angled toward the wind as if it were speaking directly to him. They moved without urgency and without debate. Jack layered up, checked the harness, clipped the leash, then paused long enough to look at the dog's face. Max met his gaze steadily, not eager, not afraid, ready in the way that came from understanding limits. Jack nodded once. It was enough. Outside, the world had narrowed to a palette of white and gray. Snow moved sideways, hard grain skittering across the surface like sparks struck from stone. Jack kept the leash loose and his steps short, reading the ground the way he had been trained to read rooms, by edges, by absence, by what did not belong. Max worked ahead in small arcs, nose low, then lifting to test the air before committing again. He did not surge forward the way a finished rescue dog might. He did not pull. Instead, he stopped often, checked angles, waited. Jack learned to pause with him, to let silence answer before motion did. They reached the ravine again by degrees rather than certainty. Max halted at the lip and angled down, testing footing, then retreated half a step to wait. Jack went first this time, boots cutting shallow steps, one hand braced against the rock. When he reached the bottom, Max followed, careful and precise, head snapping up as the wind curled through the cut and fractured scent into layers. He circled once, twice, then stopped, body stiffening. Jack crouched and followed the line of his gaze. The boy lay where they had left him hours earlier, wrapped now in emergency blankets, footprints, and stretcher tracks fading fast beneath new snow. Alive had become survived. Jack exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The rescue team arrived in pieces rather than all at once. Headlights appeared and vanished. Engines idled and cut. One of the medics, a compact woman in her 40s with close-cropped hair and eyes that measured everything without judgment, paused when she saw Max. She nodded once, the professional acknowledgement of someone who understood the value of quiet competence. "Good work," she said, not to Jack, but to the dog. Max did not react. Praise, like pressure, could wait. By mid-morning, the storm loosened its grip just enough to let the world breathe again. Jack drove back toward town with Max in the cab this time, curled tight against the heater vent, eyes open despite exhaustion. The clinic sat low against the wind, concrete and glass streaked with snowmelt. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and warm fabric. Sarah stood near the counter, auburn hair escaping her cap now that she was indoors, freckles vivid against pale winter skin. She looked smaller without the barn's shadows, but her eyes held steady as she took in Jack and the dog at his side. "He made it," she said quietly. Jack nodded. The exchange required no further language. Dr. Helen Moore arrived moments later, shrugging out of her coat as she crossed the lobby with the economy of motion that came from long practice. She was in her early 50s, tall and spare, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical knot and a face lined not by worry, but by attention. Her eyes were a pale, observant blue that missed very little. She crouched to Max's level without reaching for him, letting him read her posture before she spoke. "May I?" she asked, palm open, voice low. Max sniffed once, then sat, weight centered, a small decision that carried miles of meaning. The exam was slow and deliberate. Helen checked teeth and ears, joints and gait, murmuring observations to herself more than to anyone else. She noted the underweight frame, the scar tissue beneath fur that had grown back uneven, the discipline in the way Max held position without being told. When she passed the scanner along his shoulder, it chirped almost immediately. Helen stilled, eyes narrowing, then ran it again. "That's interesting," she said, not with surprise but with recognition. Jack felt the words land before they were explained. Helen straightened and met his gaze. "He's chipped," she said. "Registered to a regional search and rescue training program out of Idaho. Professional level work." She paused, fingers resting lightly on Max's collar. "The program shut down 4 years ago. Funding pulled. Records incomplete." Her mouth tightened at the word. These dogs were reassigned when possible. Some weren't. The room settled into a different quiet. Sarah stood a few steps back, arms folded loosely, her expression a careful blend of relief and anger, as if she were filing the information into a place she could return to later. Jack looked down at Max and saw the story align itself with what he already knew. The restraint, the waiting, the way fear had learned to wear discipline's clothes. "He didn't forget," Jack said softly. It was a statement, not a question. "No," Helen agreed. "He learned not to expect." Paperwork followed, the kind that felt heavier than it should have. Helen explained what could be verified and what could not, where the trail ended and why it might never pick up again. Jack listened, absorbing the limits without flinching. When Helen finished, Max stood and placed himself at Jack's knee, close enough to touch, far enough to keep watch. Helen noticed and smiled faintly. "That," she said, "is not accidental." They left the clinic as the sky began to lift, sunlight breaking through in thin, uncertain bands. Outside, the town moved differently now, doors opening, trucks idling, voices carrying a tone that hadn't been there yesterday. Tom Weaver waited near his pickup, beard rimed with meltwater, eyes sharp and assessing. He took in Jack, then Max, then nodded once. "Heard about the kid," he said. "Heard about the dog." It wasn't a compliment. It was acknowledgement. Jack returned the nod. That was enough. The drive back to the cabin felt shorter, though the road hadn't changed. Jack kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting lightly against Max's shoulder, grounding himself in the steady rise and fall of breath. He did not promise anything. He did not assign meaning where time had not yet earned it. When they reached the cabin, Max jumped down and made his circuit, yard, tree-line door, then returned to Jack's side without being called. The storm had taken what it needed. What remained felt different. That night, Jack sat at the table with a notebook he hadn't opened in years. He wrote without planning to, words emerging in a hand that remembered how to record rather than confess. Initial detection, scent fragmentation, waits for confirmation. He closed the book and looked at Max, who lay near the door, posture calm and resolved. "You didn't lose it," Jack said quietly. Max's ears flicked once in acknowledgement. The trust that followed was not loud. It did not celebrate. It simply stayed. Spring did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, loosening the ground a little each day, pulling color back into the land the way breath returns after a long hold. By the time the last snow retreated into the shadows beneath the firs, Max no longer looked like a dog shaped by absence. His coat had filled in, black deepened to a clean sheen, tan warmed by sunlight instead of dulled by hunger. He moved with an easy strength now, shoulders rolling smoothly beneath fur, his body finally agreeing with the discipline his mind had always carried. He still slept near the door, but the reason had changed. It was no longer a place of escape. It was a place of watch. Jack noticed the difference the first morning. He found Max lying there with his back turned to the exit, chin on his paws, eyes half-lidded, listening without fear. Jack Miller changed too, though less visibly. The hard angles in his face softened, the lines around his eyes easing as sleep became something closer to rest. He still woke early, still scanned weather and horizon out of habit, but the edge had dulled. The jacket he wore was the same, worn at the elbows, familiar as muscle memory, but it no longer felt like armor. It felt like a choice. He had stopped measuring his days by what he had lost and begun counting them by what still answered when he called. The cabin reflected the shift. A second chair appeared near the stove, salvaged from a neighbor's shed. The yard grew organized in a way that suggested planning rather than defense. Jack set aside a corner of the outbuilding and stocked it carefully. First aid kits, blankets, radios, spare harnesses, nothing flashy, nothing advertised. He didn't call it a rescue center. He didn't put up a sign. When Sarah asked him what to tell people who inquired, he shrugged and said, "Tell them I'm here." Sarah had changed in smaller ways. She came by more often now, sometimes with paperwork, sometimes with coffee. She insisted tasted better than Jack's. In spring light, Her auburn hair caught copper highlights, freckles bright against skin that had learned winter too well. She remained slender, shoulders still drawn slightly inward as if bracing against disappointment. But there was ease in her smile now, a steadiness that came from watching something broken find its footing. She never asked Jack to explain himself. She simply observed, filed what she saw, and told the town what it needed to hear without embellishment. Word spread the way it always did in places like this, not fast, but deep. A rancher lost a calf near the creek and mentioned it to Tom Weaver, who mentioned it to Sarah, who mentioned it to Jack. Jack went out with Max at first light, not with urgency, but with intention. Max found the trail where it mattered, waited when the scent thinned, circled wide when terrain demanded patience. Jack followed, confirmed, acted. They brought the calf home before noon. No sirens, no crowd. Just a nod at the fence line and a quiet thank you that carried weight because it was not asked for. More calls followed, each measured against a rule Jack never spoke aloud. They would go when it mattered. Not for curiosity, not for spectacle. Max understood the difference without being taught. He worked when asked, rested when done, and never demanded praise. His satisfaction came from completion, not applause. Jack recognized that instinct intimately. It mirrored the best parts of the work he had once loved, stripped of the noise that had finally broken it. Dr. Helen Moore visited one afternoon with a clipboard and an expression that suggested conversation rather than examination. She stood tall in the yard, steel gray hair catching the breeze, eyes moving from Max to the horizon and back again. "He's settled," she said, more observation than question. Jack nodded. Helen smiled faintly, the kind that respected restraint. "You did right by him," she added. Jack corrected her gently. "We did right by each other." Helen accepted that without argument. Some truths didn't need defending. The town followed Helen's lead. The sheriff stopped by once, hat in hand, posture open but careful. He was a square-built man in his early 60s, jaw set by years of decisions that pleased no one completely. He didn't ask Jack to sign anything. He didn't offer a badge. He said simply, "If there's a time you think we should call, you will." Jack nodded. It was not an agreement so much as an understanding. Summer edged closer. Max learned the land in green instead of white, mapping shadows and wind the way he once mapped snow. He no longer startled at sudden sounds. He assessed them. When strangers approached, he placed himself where he needed to be, calm and certain, never blocking Jack unless something in the air shifted wrong. Jack noticed how Max rested a little closer each night, how the space between them closed, not from need, but from trust. It was a different kind of bond than the one Jack had lost, quieter, older, built to last. One afternoon, Jack drove back into town for supplies and found himself parked outside the auction barn without remembering the turn that had brought him there. The building looked smaller now, boards no less weathered, but somehow less imposing. Inside, another cage rolled out, dented and scarred. A young mixed-breed dog crouched within it, thin and shaking, eyes darting like a question it did not know how to ask. The room shifted in the familiar way, boots scuffing, throats clearing, silence stretching thin. Jack did not raise his hand. He watched instead, heart steady, as a woman near the front stood slowly. She was in her 30s, hair pulled into a low ponytail, hands trembling as she lifted one halfway, then all the way, surprised by her own resolve. The gavel fell. The dog was sold. Jack exhaled, something old and tight finally loosening. Max leaned into his leg, warm and solid. The weight of a choice that did not belong to him and never had. They left without ceremony. Outside, sunlight cut through low clouds, warming the gravel lot and the day. A man called out, nodding toward Max. "That your dog?" Jack paused, looked down at the shepherd who stood alert and calm at his side, eyes forward, breath even. "Yeah," Jack said. "He is." The man smiled, satisfied. Jack drove home with the window cracked, air carrying the scent of grass and water, the land returning itself piece by piece. At the cabin, Max made his circuit, yard, tree line, fence, door, then settled on the porch where Jack's boot brushed his flank. Evening stretched long and patient. Jack sat with a cup of coffee, gone cold, thinking of the man he had been when he walked into that barn with nothing but the last of his cash and the weight of his own refusal to turn away again. He thought of the promise he had made without words. "You can come home." Max lifted his head once at a distant sound, listened, then laid it back down, deciding it did not matter. Jack smiled, not wide, but real. Some things didn't need crowds. They didn't need applause. They needed one person willing to stand up when everyone else stayed seated, and one soul willing to trust long enough to be seen. As the light faded, the house held, not as a shelter from what had been, but as a place where hope lived quietly and stayed. Not every miracle arrives loudly. Some come quietly, wrapped in fear, patience, and a second chance that almost didn't happen. In everyday life, we pass by moments like this more often than we realize. Someone overlooked, something broken, a choice that feels too small to matter. But sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stop, to see, and to say, "You don't have to survive alone anymore." Jack didn't save Max by being heroic. Max didn't become strong by being perfect. They both changed because neither turned away when walking away would have been easier. If this story reminds you of a moment in your own life, a time you were given patience instead of judgment, or a time you chose to stand up when no one else did, we'd love to hear it. Please share this story with someone who believes in second chances. Leave a comment and tell us which part stayed with you the longest. And if you find meaning in quiet stories about loyalty, healing, and hope, subscribe to the channel and join us. Because sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply be the one who doesn't walk away.